Who are the Quakers and what did they do to end the slave trade? This is a reprise of the second 2025 Elizabeth Jenkinson Memorial Lecture of the South East England Faiths Forum, which I delivered on the 13th of March this year. I'm Richard Seebohm, and I belong to the Oxford meeting of the Society of Friends, or Quakers. I'll start by talking about the Quakers. It begins perhaps with the Battle of Naseby in 1645, which was when Charles I stopped being king and when the bishops stopped being arbiters of how religion and faith should be observed in this country. In the situation of that time, in spite of Oliver Cromwell and his protectorate trying to enforce a form of Presbyterianism, there were all manner of new religious formations trying to attract believers. There were Levellers, Baptists, Anabaptists, Ranters, Presbyterians, Fifth Monarchists, Muggletonians, and perhaps more open, the Seekers. Now, George Fox he was born in Fenny Drayton in Northamptonshire, and his father was a prosperous weaver and sheepkeeper. He was born in 1624 and at first was to have been apprenticed to a shoemaker, but he was worried about the state of religion and the state of the world, and he read the Bible persistently. It was said of him much later that he probably knew the Bible as well as anyone ever has. And he went around listening to preachers and talking to people. And in about 1649, he says, "I heard a voice which said, 'There is one Jesus Christ that can speak to thy condition.' And my heart did leap for joy," because it introduced him to the basic principle that Quakers now follow, that there is that of God in every human. And he developed this, and in 1652 he found himself at Pendle Hill in Cumbria, and seems to have had an audience of up to 1,000 in a sort of pulpit cove. And he spoke so compellingly that he, from then on, had followers. And he developed them because he was a brilliant organizer, and partly because, looking for accommodation, he found himself at a place called Swarthmore Hall, which was the home of a judge called Judge Fell and his wife Margaret Fell and their 8 children. And Margaret Fell felt completely at one with the Quaker approach. And she became not only a sort of accommodation for visiting Quakers, but she became the bookkeeper and record keeper for the growing membership. And by the end of the 17th century, there were probably 60,000 Quakers. And the way it developed, well, first of all, John Bunyan, who was not actually a friend of the Quakers at all, tried to set out what he thought their beliefs had led them to. And the first one was that the Bible has lessons, but is not the inspired word of God. St. Paul said, "The letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life." And that Jesus' death was not in redemption for the original sin that tainted everyone born on account of Adam and Eve. And paradise could be here and now because of the light of Christ in everyone's heart. And that there was therefore to be no resurrection of our bodies and no millennium, a second coming of Christ's. Now, George Fox developed this, and he used a sort of phrase that he used, but one was, "Be patterns, be examples in all countries, places, islands, nations, wherever you come. Then you will come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in everyone." We have no picture of George Fox, in the sense people have tried to create one. This is a 19th century version, which is inauthentic, but he obviously was a very compelling person with an extraordinary ability to organize, because the way that Quakers worshipped was to meet in silence at set times and in set places. And during that meeting, anyone who felt inspired by the Spirit to do so could stand up and minister and speak. It would not, you could follow on what someone said, but you did not contradict anybody. The principles were then that there were no sacraments or prescribed liturgy or paid pastors, and no baptism, and no idea of having the elect of certain people who would be saved and others wouldn't, and no idea that dissenting Christians should be punished for anything, and no fixed creed, but obviously you could say what you believed. In 1656, the elders of the village of Balby in Yorkshire set out a list of all their principles. One was truth and fairness, and the truth point was you couldn't swear an oath, because if you swore an oath that you were telling the truth, it implied you were not telling the truth at other time. And everyone was equal, therefore you should not expect to take off your hat to somebody because they were better than you, which meant, of course, that the Quakers wore their hats all the time, so they didn't have to take them off to anybody. And the language, equality in language, so you used thee and thou, the second person singular, rather than saying you, implied a different degree of respect. And you obviously didn't swear, not only oaths, you didn't swear. And you went for simplicity and plainness, and the testimony which has been of greater importance ever since is peace, because in 1660, when Charles II came back on the throne and the Protectorate failed, the Quakers were accused of being like the fifth monarchists who wanted all forms of government to disappear because God was coming to claim his own. And George Fox was therefore imprisoned. Margaret Fell at the time was not imprisoned, but she, on his behalf, went to see King Charles. And this is part of what she said. Our principle is, and our practices have always been, to seek peace and ensue it. We do utterly deny all outward wars and strife and fightings with outward weapons for any end and under any pretence whatever. She was shortly arrested herself and spent about 4 years in prison, as did Fox. But and there was a Quaker Act in 1662 which banned Quaker meetings, and removed the property of Quakers. But they went on meeting, and eventually, in 1695, when James II was on the throne, was trying to make it easier for faith, partly with his Catholic friends in mind, a Quaker Act not only allowed the Quakers to appear in public, but also allowed them to affirm, to say that they were speaking the truth, and not to have to take the oath in courts and places like that. And Quaker meetings, as I say, by the end of the 17th century, there were 60,000 Quakers, and this is a picture of a typical Quaker meeting, but this actually is 1770, and you can see the women on one side and the men on the other, and the men wearing their hats. I got another picture which is rather parallel, which is again a 19th century imagining of a Quaker meeting with women on one side and the men on the other, but also the presence in the midst, because Jesus had said, when 2 or 3 are gathered together, there will I be also. It is what keeps, well, for me, it keeps me a Quaker, is when we have our Sunday meeting, and your meeting is what's called gathered. You feel that there is something there, someone there, that is not just you, which makes it so different from meditation. You may have been wondering how we came to be called Quakers. We think it arose as a term of abuse or scorn from a judge, when one of us spoke in court of trembling at the voice of the Lord. I'm now going to move on to slavery. Slavery existed in classical times with the Greeks and Romans, and since the Romans tended to tie everything up in law, they actually specified that a slave was a chattel who could be bought and sold, who could not own property, who could not appear before a court of law, and who could not have any family connections. I mean, a slave might have a partner or might have children, but they could be sold away at the whim of the master. And this definition persisted it was picked up in later life because it seemed what people thought should happen. Perhaps the next step we get to is 1492, when Christopher Columbus found the island, which now includes Haiti, which he called Hispaniola, because he was financed by Spain and claimed it for Spain. And later on, the British, by capture, claimed islands in the Caribbean. And it became clear that the Caribbean landscape was ideal for plantations of sugar cane for sugar, which was becoming a European luxury, and also for tobacco. And the local inhabitants, the First Nation people, were succumbed to European diseases like measles and smallpox, and they seemed unfitted for dragooned plantation work, and they sort of melted away and actually disappeared in the Caribbean, disappeared from view. And the capture and transporting of Africans by trading shippers had begun probably before this, but they were taken to Europe either as domestic servants or as curiosities. But it gradually became clear that they were well suited for plantation work because they were immune to local diseases because of from childhood, because of how they'd grown up, and they were used to the climate. And the Europeans tended to find it possible either to buy them from local rulers who possibly had them as prisoners of war or were prepared to sell them away, or by kidnapping, or by purchasing as individuals. And the three-way slave trade took the form not only of the carriage of the slaves to the Caribbean, but the bringing of means of payment from Europe, things like fabric, tools, workwear, guns, gunpowder, pieces of metal, alcohol, tobacco, and miscellaneous giftware. And the conditions under which this happened were soon extremely unpleasant. This is an illustration of whose provenance I don't know, but it seems to capture what went on. They were camped in what's called barracoons, sort of barracks before being shipped, and they were shipped packed like sardines into boats with no headroom, with often shackled at the time. They were often branded to make sure who they were owned by, and fed, given little cups, and they were fed cooked beans and rice and given water. And sometimes they were brought on deck to jump about, which the ship owners called dancing, which was to make sure that their muscles didn't degenerate too much. And by 1600, it was the pattern is a going concern, and the sugars are being cropped, and also slaves are being used on the mainland of Brazil for gold and silver mining. And not much is sort of heard about reactions to this. Certainly popes were known to have opposed the idea of slavery, which were completely ignored. Come 1660, it turned out that two young women, one of them Mary Fisher, who'd also been preaching Quakerism to the Sultan of Turkey, came to Barbados and converted a lot of the European inhabitants, mostly in the slave trade, to Quakerism. And it occurred to George Fox to go and see what was happening there. He and some other friends took ship and went there in 1671. There were 5 different Quaker meetings. There were 6,000 Quakers, 20,000 planters, and 40,000 slaves on Barbados. And I have to say, he probably didn't know what to make of it. He said that the slaves should be treated with kindness, and after a number of years, say 30 years, they should be made free. He didn't say what that implied. And one of the people who went with him, called William Edmondson, said that the slaves had the capacity to adopt the Christian faith and should be treated with consideration. And in 1676, George Fox, in a pamphlet, which not I think well known, Christ died for the tawnies and for the blacks, as well as for you that are called whites. Now, the next serious concern about slavery that is on record is a group of Germans who started life in Germany as Mennonites, and they are visited by George Fox and William Penn and converted to Quakerism, and they emigrated to Pennsylvania, which was in 1681 had been founded by William Penn, because his father had been an admiral for King Charles II and was owed a debt. And they founded a community called Germantown, and they sent to their local monthly meeting a statement, "To bring men hither and sell them against their will, we stand against." And unfortunately, the Quaker meeting, the clerk to the Quaker meeting was a slave owner. And he said, this is too great a matter for us to determine. In America, the concern about slaves gradually grew. In 1712, they sent an inquiry to London Yearly Meeting saying, what should we do about slavery? And London Yearly Meeting did nothing until 1727, and eventually said, it is the sense of this meeting that the importation of Negroes from their native country and relations by friends is not a commendable or allowable practice, and that practice is censured by this meeting. But that really is saying that Quakers ought not to be involved in slavery, rather than an outright attack on it. The Pennsylvanians did get their act together, partly someone called John Woolman, who is well known to Quakers because of his journal. In 1742, he was required as a clerk to write a bill of sale for selling a woman slave, and he suddenly realized what this implied. He wrote the bill of sale, but from then on campaigned against the slave trade and slavery. And more importantly, almost in a sense, a friend, someone well known to him, who we discussed things with, called Anthony Benezet, came onto the scene. He was from a French Protestant Huguenot family, which, persecuted in France, emigrated to England, and so that young Benezet spoke English, and they then emigrated to Pennsylvania. And Benezet was a teacher, and he found himself not only teaching the ordinary American colonists, but teaching blacks and teaching black girls. And he found them as capable as any of learning what he had to offer. And he researched the slave situation in enormous detail, the geography of the countries from which they came, and the ships that they were shipped in, and the conditions in which they came. And his pamphlets or writings were circulated in enormous quantities. And they were taken up by British Quakers and passed to and circulated to, well, MPs and all people of importance, including the royals, that they can come across. The next sort of link in the chain, as it were, is again not a Quaker link. It's in 1765 in London, a civil servant called Granville Sharp found an African on the street who had been almost beaten to death by his master. And he took him home, restored him to health, and enabled him to live as a normal person. Unfortunately, 2 years from then, his master saw him in the street, grabbed him, and sold him back into slavery. Now, Granville Sharp took this very seriously, and he studied every aspect of the law regarding individual rights, as it were. And when another slave turned out, he found him in prison, I'm not sure for what, and he introduced a writ claiming that he should be released. And this went through legal processes over 2 years, and the Lord Chief Justice eventually had to admit that there was no provision in British law for the condition of slavery, and therefore that the slaves should be released. And he did this with great reluctance. And that again was an example, and the Scottish law was amended similarly. And Granville Sharp came on another, as it were, case in 1783. A slaving ship called the Long was carrying 400-something slaves, and the captain missed his course, and the slaves, there was not enough water and food. So he had 133 slaves thrown overboard, and so the loss could be claimed on insurance from an accident at sea. And the insurers paid up. So Sharp sued the crew, the captain and mate, for murder, and that went to Lord Chief Justice Mansfield. Here he was able to judge that the jettisoning of slaves was no different from the jettisoning of horses. Now, in parallel alongside all this, something else which is much more important to the slavery campaign and the Quakers, an Anglican cleric called Peter Peckard was master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, and he heard about the Zong story and then saw some of the Benezet writings, and he introduced a prize competition for an essay on slavery. And one of his students, Thomas Clarkson, who was basically a mathematician, thought he'd have a go, and he absolutely took this on board and in 1784 won the essay prize. And he went to London wondering how that essay could be published. And he talked to a familiar publisher, and who wouldn't take it. And then he found a Quaker publisher called James Phillips. And so in 1786, it was translated from Latin, which it had been its original language, into ordinary English and published, and again very widely circulated. Now, next step, which is again not exactly Quaker. In the 1780s, the Clapham sect was formed, which consisted of well-meaning but upper middle class or upper class almost, including William Pitt, who had become Prime Minister in 1783, aged 24, and William Wilberforce, who joined the Clapham sect after a real evangelical conversion. And he consulted William Pitt on what he should do for the benefit of mankind now he was a Christian. And Pitt suggested, why don't we have a go at slavery? Which he did from then on, because he was already, in his 20s, a member of Parliament. Because he came from Hull and had a large family fortune, so he could afford to bribe his way into Parliament, as one did then. And it so happened that Thomas Clarkson met some of the Clapham sect people and was introduced to Wilberforce, and between them they formed a partnership. And Clarkson spent, and because Clarkson had money of his own as well, he spent the second half of 1787 going to every shipping port in Britain that furnished slavers. And he saw the conditions in which the Africans were to be confined. He eventually got advised to look at the muster rolls of the seamen, which is the records kept of the sailors who sailed. And he found that in an ordinary Atlantic voyage, perhaps one or two of the seamen would fail to get home. But on the slaving ships, 2/3 failed to get home, and those that did were completely broken men, in both alcoholic and completely shattered by what they'd seen and done. And from then on, and also in 1787, which is about 1783, about this time, a Quaker committee was formed of 22 friends to deal with the slavery question. And this got in touch with the Clapham sect people, and they formed a new sort of joint committee, in which most of the people were Quakers, but a couple of them were not. William Wilberforce was very much of it, but was not formally a member of the committee. And they wondered what to do with the evidence that Thomas Clarkson had collected. And they knew that Parliament was full of pro-slavers, but William Pitt was able to use the machinery of the Order in Council, because he could do that as Prime Minister, and all it needed was the King's signature. And so he set up a committee of inquiry which examined all the Clarkson evidence. It also took in evidence from the slave trade, where the people said the slaves enjoyed their voyages and were happier in the Caribbean than they had been in their home country, which the evidence did not support. In 1789, Wilberforce made an opening speech in Parliament for an abolition bill, which lasted 3.5 hours, and is perhaps famous for the fact that everybody listened, and he went on for that length of time, and was the most convincing piece of parliamentary discourse that some people said they had ever heard. But then it failed to get through as a motion because the leader of the House of Commons said there was too much business and it couldn't go through. Anyway, it failed, and Wilberforce's subsequent attempts at legislation got through the Commons, or didn't, but certainly never got through the Lords for a certain period of time to come. The Quakers were not quiescent. At the early meeting, 1789, William Allen, who is someone we hear of from time to time in this talk, proposed a boycott of slave-grown sugar, which caught on and did very well. And also this appeared in various versions of it from Wedgwood, and apparently it was Peter Peckard of Magdalen we heard of before who suggested that form of words. In 1788, an independent MP called William Dolben had seen a slave ship and realised how they were used, and he introduced a bill to limit the number of slaves that a ship of a given tonnage should carry, and also insist that where they were between decks, the height of the decks should be at least 4 foot 1 inch, which doesn't sound much, but it probably helped. And it got it through Parliament as a cabinet measure, because of course the 3-line whip hadn't been invented in those days. The House of Lords tried to stop it but failed, but made it a 1-year event only. So it had to be renewed every year until 1799. It was W.H. Smith, the parent of the newsagent, the ultimate parent of the newsagent family, managed to make it permanent, and also raised the height of the gap between the decks from 4 foot 1 inches to 5 feet. The ships, actually, it's worth seeing the picture. This is the picture that Thomas Clarkson produced. I don't know whether he drew it himself or had it done for him, of a ship called the Brooks in 1781, which was set out to carry 600 odd slaves, but at the worst had carried 733. And you can just see the extraordinary extent of the cruelty of carrying individual humans like that. At that time, Clarkson also went round the whole of Britain holding meetings, which apparently extremely well subscribed, and convincing people about the slave problem. And of course it was through the Quaker network that he was able to find out where to go next and find out who would support him. And a lot of the players are non-Quakers, but in fact it's the Quaker background that actually makes a difference to all this. Because there's also petitions. In 1791, large numbers of petitions for the abolition of the slave trade were presented to Parliament, because in those days, with the very feeble coverage, constituency coverage, and rotten boroughs, the only way you could get something new into Parliament from outside was to offer a petition, and there was a formality for it, and they had to be introduced by an MP, which of course Wilberforce was glad to do. And at that time, women's signatures appeared to be not accepted, but petitions appeared to be the best way of communicating with Parliament. In 1789, of course, the French Revolution had happened, and Clarkson himself had gone to France and mobilised anti-slavery concerns over there, and he had been helped in the foundation of a body called Les Amis des Noirs, Friends of the Blacks. Clarkson himself disappeared as a farmer into the Lake District, and he got married, but he came back on the scene later on. Quakers were a little bit out of things at this moment, but in 1791, the London Yearly Meeting had reckoned that keeping Quakers out of slavery was not the only thing to do. We feel it our Christian duty to promote the abolition of the slave trade as a countrywide measure. which which moved things on. And also in 1791, the island of Haiti, at least the country of Haiti in the island of San Domingo, the slaves rebelled and set up their own government, and through a lot of vicissitude, changes of ruler and that sort of thing, it's stayed independent, because in 1802 Napoleon took over the French government and sent an army to try and put down the Haiti revolt, and failed because two-thirds of his troops fell ill with tropical diseases, and which also led Napoleon to engage in what's called the Louisiana Purchase, where he sold a large chunk of America to the American Republic for $15 million. And that went with it a lot of the unexplored states to the west. And of course, most of that southern area became slave country, and where cotton was grown but with the use of slaves. In 1793, the French guillotined King Louis XVI and proceeded to declare war on Britain. This caused some disturbance in the British state, and so the abolition of slavery rather took a back seat. For example, for security reasons, no meetings of more than 50 people were allowed. It was only in 1804 that the Slave Trade Committee, after being laid down for 7 years, was reunited with Clarkson present. And Clarkson started trying to rouse port again, and William Pitt, as Prime Minister, was ailing, and his successor, William Grenville, who he raised to the peerage, was able to get him to introduce an order in council, and the order in council banned the import of slaves in British ships into Demerara, which had become British by conquest in recent years. And as such, it was a crown colony, and not like the established British colonies, which had legislatures of their own. And the other colonies didn't object too much, because they didn't want the competition of extra sugar growing. But in January 1806, Pitt died, and Grenville, who was now Prime Minister, took the bull by the horns and introduced a bill to ban the import of slaves in British ships into any new British colony, of which there was one or two others, and also banned the import by British ships into non-British colonies as well, because this was part of the blockade against the continent of Europe, which Napoleon was gradually taking over. The way was now clear for Grenville to introduce the final abolition bill into the House of Lords. And it got through, and it got through the Commons. And it said that the African slave trade was unlawful and abolished. British ships and slaves that they carried were to be impounded, and the owners, managerial staff and ship's officers were to be fined £100 per slave. Insurers were to be fined £100 as well, and 3 times the premium. The slaves were to become Crown property. Now this is what is particularly interesting. The ships that have been impounded by the Royal Navy, which of course was still going strong because it's still wartime, were impounded by the Royal Navy and taken to Sierra Leone, where there was to be established an admiralty court. Sierra Leone had actually been founded on the African coast, had been founded by the abolitionist group of Clarkson, Wilberforce and others in 1787 as a home for freed slaves. And it was hoped there that they would learn how to cultivate land and how to engage in perfectly normal trading. And so the slaves were to be freed in Sierra Leone, and as an experiment, as it were, they were to be known as apprentices, which means they would work for local owners at no pay, but only be released to trade on their own after a certain period. This was not made clear in the legislation. And also in the Act, the crews, master and crew of the naval ships were to be paid bonuses for every slave captured, and of course graduated by rank. And of course, it was the bonuses that made it plausible and workable for the Navy to be employed in this activity. There was a complication here. In fact, the Americans, the United States, had abolished their slave trade in an act of 1807 as well, but they did not provide any means for implementing it, so the Americans carried on as slavers. Furthermore, after the War of Independence of 1776, the Americans had been very resistant to the idea that Britain should have control of the seas, and they did not allow American ships to be challenged or boarded by the British Navy. And of course, what happened was that when a Portuguese or Spanish ship was carrying slaves and was challenged by the British Navy, they immediately ran up an American flag and sailed away free. I'm not going to go into the details of how this was negotiated and eventually overcome. Then in 1814, the war with Napoleon came to an end. Napoleon was defeated, and consequently there were peace negotiations. They started in London, but then they ended up in Vienna. But the abolitionists were very keen to see an anti-slavery element inserted into the treaties, and they were only partially successful. Slavery was mentioned as something to be deplored rather than something that the treaties actually had leverage on. But in negotiations, the slavery abolitionists were very active. They went to see particularly the Duke of Wellington as an English or British negotiator, but also the foreign ones, and in particular the Tsar of Russia, Alexander III, who was quite young, newly appointed after his father had died. And in coming to London, he had expressed a wish to go to a Quaker meeting. And because he had been lobbied by Quakers on the slavery issue, and he did so in full imperial uniform. And later on, Clarkson kept a correspondence with him, and he asked Clarkson whether Clarkson was a Quaker. And what Clarkson said was, "I am 9/10 of that persuasion." Furthermore, Clarkson had in 1806 written a book, A Portrait of Quakerism, which described the Quaker movement and everything about Quakers in a way that nothing in the public print had ever attempted before. So I think for the purposes of this story, I'm justified in treating Clarkson as one with the Quakers. Now, the peace treaties just were not the end of the story, because slavery in the tropical countries as a practice still existed, even if the attempt to ship new slaves to them had been only partially successful, but was still very much in force. To follow up the British abolition, the British government and Lord Castlereagh as Foreign Secretary tried to induce other governments to ban the slave trade as well. And 1818, a treaty was signed with Spain, which involved the payment of £400,000 as compensation not for the slave owners, but for the shippers. It's unclear that any of the money got through to the intended destination. And in 1819, a similar treaty was signed with Portugal, where the douceur the payment was £300,000. Now, in 1823, the Abolition Committee was reconstituted, but calling for the gradual abolition of slavery now that the slave trade had been abolished. And one of the leading lights in it now was somebody called Thomas Fowell, F-O-W-E-L-L, Fowell Buxton, who was of a Quaker family and with a Quaker wife, but not formally, and he went to meeting, but he was not formally a Quaker, so he could take the oath, and became the leading abolitionist member of Parliament as successor to William Wilberforce, who was now old and infirm. And also in 1823, George Canning, who was now the Foreign Secretary because Castlereagh had committed suicide, introduced an order in council which was intended to improve the treatment of slaves in the colonies where slavery was still practiced. And it was a very interesting document. It insisted that religious instruction should be available to all slaves. And this was partly because if they were to be allowed to take part in court proceedings, legal proceedings, but in order to do that, they had to swear the ordinary oath that they would tell the truth. And until they knew what they were swearing about, they couldn't actually take part in this. And in some colonies, they were made to get a certificate from a minister of religion that they were capable of understanding the gospel to this extent. There was to be appointed people of magistrate status who were protectors of slaves, and no one was to be whipped, because in the whole of the slave business, the actual practice of agriculture had been enforced by the use of the whip. I'm going to show you a picture. This is by a lady called Amelia Opie, who was a Quaker and what was known as a gay Quaker because she wore ordinary clothes, and she was a best friend of Elizabeth Fry, who supported women in prison. And there were no whipping, and especially no female was to be flogged, because apparently there were plenty of stories of female household slaves being flogged to death because they had dropped the dinner dish or whatever. Slaves were to be free to marry and to keep their families together rather than to be sold apart. And also at the same time, piracy, death penalty for captured slavers. This didn't last actually. In 1837, they were just going to be transported. And this was an order in council which applied directly to the Crown colonies, and it was hoped that the other colonies would implement it. But they, to the extent they did, was not at all clear, because why should they, in a sense? Because there was no way that the British government could enforce these requirements. This may be the time to mention a difference of emphasis between the Clapham sect evangelicals and the Quakers. Both were strongly distressed by the cruelty and the fact of slavery, but the Quakers saw slaves as fellow humans with that of God within them, while the evangelicals saw them as souls to be saved. Indeed, the churches, but not the Quakers, sent out missionaries, and sometimes the missionaries were blamed when on a certain occasion did slaves rebel. And indeed, there was a slave Bible which removed all mention of captivity or freedom. The business of gradual emancipation of slaves was challenged by a woman called Elizabeth Hayrick, who, coming from the Midlands, produced pamphlets and would travel around convincing other women and producing petitions signed by women, which went to Parliament. And for abolition, Clarkson and his followers got a petition, about 1 million altogether, half of them from women and half of them from men this time. And the political situation was that the Reform Bill was approaching, which was to extend parliamentary suffrage by a certain amount, by a certain property qualification, but in particular to create new constituencies in the industrial towns where there had been no parliamentary representation at all. And obviously the Lords, who controlled rotten boroughs and the appointment of many of the MPs, fiercely resisted this. And by this time, 1832, William IV was now king, George IV having died, and William IV was persuaded that he would be prepared to create new peers to get the measure through, which is, as it were, a foretaste of what happened in the early 20th century. And eventually the Reform Bill went through, and of course the new Parliament was completely different, and the House of Lords was a cowed body. And so the 1833 Act, more or less incorporating the items in the Canning Order in Council, became law. William Wilberforce died during 1833 when the passage of the law was clear, but before it had actually become law. This picture perhaps shows why he was so persuasive. the abolition was at first, because it was difficult to know exactly how to handle it, the slaves were to be apprenticed, which meant that for 6 years they were to work for their masters with no wages but given board and lodging, and in 6 years' time they were to become free, and it was hoped that they would find some way of looking after their economic and home interests themselves. And also the slave owners should be compensated, because they, in losing the service of their slaves, the slave was worth £37, and shortly before the slave, there had been a registration process, so that in the colonies there were registers of all the slaves, and registration was kept in the records were kept in London. And at £37 a slave, the amount required was £20 million. And that £20 million was raised by a British Treasury loan stock, and the last bit of it was redeemed in 2024. The apprenticeship system was ragged, to say the least, and there was still whipping of slaves, there were still misdemeanours of one sort or another, and instead of in 6 years, in 4 years it fell apart, and even without legislation, and the slaves were free. In 1840 there was yet another very large meeting with a lot of Americans present, and there's a picture here of Thomas Clarkson addressing this meeting shortly before he died, frankly, his age 80. And the only problem at that meeting was that Elizabeth Hayrick's campaigning had alerted various Americans, in particular someone called William Garrison and Lucretia Mott, and they therefore brought over a contingent of American women abolitionists to this meeting, who were denied seating in the hall, and they were only allowed in eventually to a gallery, which is the only sort of slightly negative aspect of it. Of course, Elizabeth Hayrick and her Americans were Quakers. And that is the end of my story of slavery, of British slavery. But there is more, because it lasted in America until the 1861 American Civil War. In America, there was a Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed a slave owner to recapture escaped and runaway slaves, even from the northern states where slavery itself was illegal. This prompted the creation of what was called the Underground Railroad, whereby slaves were passed from household to household, often mainly Quaker households, from wherever they'd come from up to Canada, where they could definitely be freed. One of the leading lights of this was a freed slave called Harriet Tubman. And I'm going to show you this picture without explanation, and Harriet Tubman is the hunched figure on the extreme left. And I'm going to close with a single picture which shows the feel of slavery on the Middle Passage on the ocean, just to show what it feels like to be on the boat. Later on, of course, the steamers came in, but throughout the British Navy produced the clapped-out ships for the slave captures, and the fact that they managed quite a lot is really rather remarkable. I shall end my story there. Thank you.